Welcome to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. I'm Pastor Chris Miller. The world is unsettled, but that doesn't mean you have to be. This podcast is for people who want to walk calmly and confidently with Jesus in uncertain times. I'm not here to tell you what to think or what to do. You make your own decisions. My aim is simple: to help you walk with Christ in a way that cultivates Christ-like character through clear thinking, intentional living, and confidence formed by conviction. We'll talk about scripture, culture, faith, and everyday obedience. And together, we'll learn to walk faithfully with Jesus day in and day out. We're walking this road together, faithful, grounded, and free.
Most of us wouldn't say we're in control, but we live like we are. We tend to complacently think we know what's going to happen tomorrow. And then every once in a while, something happens that shows us we're actually not in control. And it's often suffering that gives us the clearest insight to the fact that we're not in control. And that's exactly where we find Job. We started talking about him last week. Job, he didn't suffer gradually. He didn't lose control gradually. He had everything taken from him all at once. And even God himself says that Job is blameless and upright. He's a good guy. In any story, we see that good people sometimes suffer. Suffering isn't always the result of behavior. Sometimes it just happens. It may be the result of a bad decision, but sometimes there's nothing we can do about it. It just happens. And suffering is a topic that is familiar to me, as I'm sure it is for most of you. Not so much because of my own suffering, but because I've seen a lot of it. Some of it I've even caused. But we're not always in control of why we suffer. We're not in control of how or when either. And like I said, we're not talking about things that can be avoided through good decisions. I saw this reel on, I don't know, Instagram or something the other day, and this guy was driving down the road in his car, and there was a huntsman spider that was climbing up the A-pillar in his car, and he just steered his car off a cliff, which is kind of funny. If you've ever had a huntsman in your car, you might know what that's like. If you're in Australia, you certainly know what a huntsman is. If not, it's a big, scary-looking spider. They're harmless, but they look threatening. But if you don't want to end up in the hospital, don't drive your car off a cliff. Sometimes suffering is the result of a decision. Sometimes it's not. And today, we're moving from the false expectation that righteous behavior is a shield against suffering, like we talked about last week, to the false belief in control, the false belief that we have control over things, the illusion of control. Last week, we saw how overwhelming and chaotic and uncontrollable suffering can be in Job chapter 1. There were messengers that came and reported to Job what had happened. And we read that while one was still speaking, another came with more bad news, and another came with more bad news, and another came with more bad news. Job experienced rapid, compounding loss. No warning, no time to collect himself in between, and he didn't know why it was happening. First, there was an external loss. Then that loss led to personal, internal suffering, just like it does for us. And Job was upright, blameless. He had a very good life, great family. He was wealthy. Job made sacrifices for his sons, not because he knew they had sinned, but just in case they had. And maybe that was Job's attempt to protect what he had. He'd make, the sacrifices he made weren't because his sons had sinned. They were just in case they had and he didn't know about it. But maybe that was his way of protecting what he had, which in a sense is a way to try to control it. They weren't sacrifices made in repentance, but sacrifices made just in case. And we all attempt to control outcomes to some degree. We should always make the best decision we can with the knowledge we have at the time, but that doesn't mean bad things won't happen. Be nice, but that's not how it goes. In Job chapter 2, verses 3 through 8, the Lord has a very similar interaction with Satan to the one we read about in chapter 1. This is what it said, starting in Job chapter 2, verse 3. It says, "The Lord said to the adversary, 'Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and an upright man, who fears God and avoids evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you move me against him to destroy him without cause. The adversary answered the Lord, saying, Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life. Put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. The Lord said to the adversary, Very well, he is in your hand, but spare his life. Therefore, the adversary went out from the presence of the Lord, and he afflicted Job with severe sores from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. So he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Again, Satan is attempting to tell God he's not worthy of being highest in anyone's life, and no one really believes that he is. People only love God for what they can give him or what he can give them, and not for who he is. And Satan has taken away the things God has given to Job, his family, his possessions, and that didn't destroy Job's trust in God. So Satan pushes past that to the point of Job's health. Satan is saying that there is no such thing as genuine faith. Nobody really trusts God to the point of giving up their life. Faith is really nothing more than a selfish desire or a survival instinct. And that's what Satan is saying. And I've heard some secular voices echo a similar sentiment in saying that religion is something humans developed as a means of coping with the reality of suffering and death. But I don't think that accounts for a personal faith that serves God not to soften or avoid things, but because he's truly highest. In John 15:13, Jesus says, Greater love has no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends. And that demonstrates something we've spoken about many times before, that love is more than an emotion or a feeling. It's a conscious, sacrificial choice. Most of us probably know someone we at least think we would be willing to die for. I know several people like that I think I would. Yeah, but that feeling's not limited to Christians. We can't know what we would actually do until we face a situation like that, which I hope none of us do. But we often think of what Jesus says as speaking about one person demonstrating love by dying for another. But it also means giving our lives to serve others. Now, Jesus demonstrated both of those. He gave his life on the cross and he served others. He came not to be served, but to serve. And people with many different beliefs believe it's worthwhile to serve someone, even to the point of suffering and death. The difference between human belief or moral behavior and genuine faith is believing that the same is certainly true of God. We don't understand, even when we don't understand difficult circumstances. But Satan is saying that humans only serve God because of what they can get from him or because it's a survival instinct, not because they hold a faith that displays genuine love and trust for him. And when we look at the fact that Jesus says, you know, uh, there's no greater love than a man lay down his life for his friends, if a person would do that for another person, then certainly why wouldn't we do it for God? And I think what it takes to cross from one to the other, the kind of faith that is, what I can get, to the faith that is God is highest no matter what, is humility that lets go of the illusion of control. And Job is in a position where he had lost everything: health, possessions, family, everything. He's sitting in ashes. He's mourning. That's a cultural practice of the day. And he's scraping the sores on his body with a broken piece of pottery. That's a pretty tough place to be. And that's when we come to Job chapter 2, verse 9. And his wife comes to him and she says, Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. And that doesn't sound very sportive, does it? It sounds like she's, not being very sportive at all. I heard a comedian talking about Job once, Tim Hawkins. Maybe you've heard of him. He was talking about how Satan took everything but left him with his wife. I don't know what that says about her. But what Job's wife says is confronting. She says, Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. I think it's helpful to realize that when she says what she does, she's speaking from a place of tremendous pain. Outside of his health, she's mourning the exact same losses as Job. She's lost her family, family wealth is gone. Now, this is just me speculating, but I wonder if Satan left Job's wife because he knew it would cause Job more pain to see his wife suffer those losses as well. If you have ever seen someone you love suffer, you may be able to relate to that. At the same time, she's watching her husband suffer, covered in ashes and sores. She says, are you still holding on to your integrity? Even after everything, we see Job is still holding on to God after he's lost everything possessions, family, and even his health. He still trusts God. To his wife, at least in this particular moment, that seems unreasonable. And she says, curse God and die. Now, why would anyone say something like that? We talked about the word curse last week, tied to the idea of bless, but here again it's used as a euphemism. She's telling Job to let go of his faith and stop relying on God. You've lost everything. Why do you keep hanging on to that? And the literal meaning of die is to give up and let death come. Emotionally, it's like she's saying there's nothing left to live for. She says what Satan is trying to get Job to say. And in Job's wife, what we see more than just her, what she says, we see the pressure that suffering puts on faith. It shows us what we sometimes do when we lose control. What Job's wife says is not just an expression of pain and despair, it's a desperate attempt to end the tension between trusting God and suffering. But tension is something we manage. We've talked about that before as well. It's not a problem to solve. And what Job's wife says is what it looks like when we try to control something that's beyond our control, that we can't control. In in their interaction, you'll notice that neither Job nor his wife reveals any struggle with the existence of God. That's not where that tension lies. The tension is found in trusting God in the midst of suffering that we can't control. And that's a tension we are likely to experience in suffering. And we may feel that way. And remember, in both of his interactions with God, Satan said about Job, take what he has and he'll curse you to your face. Job's wife brings an earthly voice to the question, is God still worthy when suffering is unbearable? If we suffer enough and we have no means of control, we may ask that same question. We shouldn't assume that we wouldn't do that because we don't really know until we're in that position. But the question itself doesn't mean you don't have a trusting faith. It does, however, bring you to a crossroads. Am I going to trust God or am I not going to trust God in this? So, as we talked about last week, we know that righteousness is not a shield against suffering. Job was blameless, upright, good guy, but he still suffered. But we also need to know that neither is trusting God. That's not a shield against suffering. Doesn't mean God's not worth trusting. It's just not a shield against suffering. Now, if we believe that righteousness is a shield against suffering or trusting God is a shield against suffering, if we believe those things are, we're living with an illusion of control, believing that if I act morally enough, or if I trust God enough, or if I just have enough faith, I will insulate myself against suffering, is an illusion of control. And that's why we should be careful with phrases like, you just need more faith, or I need more faith, or have enough faith, or I'm believing God for this. Sometimes we hear phrases like that. You need to be careful with stuff like that because those things don't necessarily change circumstances. If at this point Job were to do as his wife says and curse God and die and abandon his faith, it wouldn't put an end to his suffering. Job's wife is suffering too, but what she says is not helpful to anyone. At least on some level, what she's doing is making an attempt to control something that is outside of her control. As I mentioned, suffering is a topic somewhat familiar to me because I've been with people who have suffered. I have also, seen well-meaning people unintentionally hurt others because they don't have the stability to be at peace in the tension of suffering. We want to escape or control suffering, even the suffering of others. It makes us feel awkward. We don't like to be around suffering. When other people are suffering, it makes us uncomfortable. And if we're very honest about it, we often act in a way that reflects our own discomfort. When someone is suffering, we feel tension, we feel awkward. We're concerned for them, we don't know what to do. And instead of learning stability in the tension, we try to solve suffering like it's a problem, but we can't solve suffering. Suffering generally doesn't just stop suddenly. It fades over time as you process it, learn from it, work through it. When we lose a loved one, we don't just come to a point where grieving stops. We kind of work through it over time. And we can't change that. That's just the way things are. You manage tension by learning to be at peace with it, by remaining in God's presence and trusting Him for who He is. Maybe you've seen the scene in Batman where young Bruce Wayne goes to the theater with his parents and he's scared. And so they leave. As they're leaving, a guy robs him at gunpoint, and the robber ends up killing both of Bruce's parents. Then we see Bruce next scene at the police station, and Batman lore says he's about 8 or 10 years old when this happens. I think it's 8 in the comics, more 10 years old in the movies. But his age is significant because he's old enough to understand loss, but he's still too young to process it or attempt to control it. So he sits in it, but he's not at peace. He's not only sad, but he's also scared and confused because everything that made life feel stable for him is suddenly gone. He understands the loss, but he can't process it. When suffering is severe enough, we probably won't be able to process it either, at least not immediately. Those things take time. And young Bruce is looking around. He's scared and confused when Commissioner Gordon, well, actually, it was probably Officer Gordon at the time, he walks in, he sees Bruce sitting there, and he asks, "Is that your father's coat on the back of the chair?" And he takes the coat and he puts it around Bruce's shoulders and he says, "It's okay. It's okay." Then, as Gordon walks out, the police chief walks in and gives Bruce the sort of smile you would give a kid in that situation. And he tells Bruce, "We got him." They had caught the guy who murdered his parents. And many people would see those two men and what they are trying to do for young Bruce is a good thing. And to their credit, they're trying. It's only a movie, it's just characters, but they're trying to do a good thing. They're trying to comfort Bruce. But the most telling part of the scene is when the police chief says, "We got him." And Bruce looks up at him with a confused look on his face. And I thought the actor actually played that very well. Now, Officer Gordon is telling Bruce it's okay, and that's well meaning, but the reality is it's not okay, not at all. He just was witnessed the murder of both of his parents. He's thinking, "What do you mean it's okay? It's not okay. That is not okay. He's not going to be okay." Saying it's okay in this case, it not only does nothing for him, it's not true. It's actually a lie. And then the police chief walks in and tells him, "We got him." That does not change Bruce's situation in the least. Everything that he believes helps him to be stable, he's lost. And that's why he looks at the chief like, what am I supposed to do with that? They You see, they weren't trying to just comfort Bruce. They're trying to fix something that can't be fixed, like Joe's wife, but nice. They're trying to control something they can't control. And I'm not blaming them. Like I say, it's just a movie. But many people don't understand that when someone is suffering, some of the things we might say aren't that different from saying, if we say it's okay or um, whatever we might say, or I know how you feel, things like that. Uh, it's really not that much different from saying, "Stop it, you're making me uncomfortable." But the one who's suffering can't stop it. And we try to take control of suffering that can't be controlled. And when we do that, we're not helping ourselves or anyone else. When life falls apart, whether it be our own or someone else's, we don't just suffer. We often also reach for control. We try to control something. When supporting someone who's suffering, or navigating our own suffering, we sometimes try to take control and treat it like a problem to be solved instead of attention to manage. And that can't be solved. Suffering can't be solved. And we sometimes do that by rushing ourselves or others out of pain or trying to fight our way out of it too quickly or faith our way out of it, whatever it might be. I think that's sometimes why people don't share their suffering with others because they know that other people are going to try to take control of it, try to solve it, try to fix it, tell them something that's not true, like it's okay. And we'll talk about that more next week, but who knows what the week ahead holds. So I'll give you this. As Christians, we want to be the kind of people where people don't feel like they have to hide suffering because they're afraid someone else is going to try to control it and unintentionally add to it. Early in ministry, I used to feel like I needed to say something profound to people who were suffering. I've done a lot of funerals over the years. And when I first started doing it, doing funerals, talking to people who were suffering loss, whatever it might be, I used to feel like I needed to say something that was going to make things better for them. Over time, I realized that's not possible, but that wanting to do that was really a desire for control because their suffering made me uncomfortable. The reality is that most of the time, maybe all of it, there's nothing anyone can say that will end someone else's suffering. When someone has just lost a loved one or been through a major loss of some kind and they're suffering, there's nothing you can say that's going to make that better. There's nothing that's going to rush them through it or make it stop. When you give up the illusion of control, that's when you begin to trust God in your own suffering. And it's also when you are able to be supportive in someone else's suffering. Often, the best thing you can do for someone who is suffering is simply recognize their suffering and then zip it and make room for them to suffer. We don't say, I know how you feel, because you don't know how they feel. Even if you've been through a similar circumstance, it doesn't mean you know how they feel. People handle things differently. Don't say it's okay, because it's not. Just be present in their suffering. And it's okay to say, I can tell you're suffering or something similar to that, or you suffered a big loss, but don't rush. Be stable. Trust God and learn to sit comfortably in the tension. That's the best thing you can do for someone who's suffering. We we think control is going to bring peace, but control is an illusion. We can't control suffering. In verse 10, Job says to his wife, "You talk like one of the foolish women talks." We've talked about how two people can go through similar circumstances, but affects them differently. In this case, both Job and his wife are crushed, but they respond to the suffering differently. Two voices, same suffering, different responses. Job says, You talk like one of the foolish women talks. And now that's an interesting thing to say to your wife. The Bible says Job was blameless and upright, but it never said he was smart. And this reminds me a little bit of a time when one of my buddies was having a big fight with his wife. And he walked into his bedroom and he got one of those big full length mirrors that you used to get dressed. And he brought it out and he held it in front of his wife and said, Would you just look at yourself right now? And you can probably imagine how that went. He may have thought, well, if she sees how she's acting, maybe she'll say, Oh my goodness, look at me. I'm being terrible. It may also have been that he simply woke up that day and chose violence. A couple of things about what Job says. First, he's not calling his wife foolish. He says she's acting foolish. And there's a big difference between those things. The meaning of foolish is another one of those meanings that shift over time, across contexts, across cultures. Language is a living thing and it changes over time. When we use the word foolish, we might mean unintelligent or stupid. The dictionary defines it as lacking good sense or judgment or unwise. Intelligence doesn't guarantee good judgment or wisdom. We've all acted in a foolish way at some point in our lives. Like my friend with the mirror, he wasn't unintelligent, he was just foolish. In Scripture, foolish is used to mean lacking good sense or judgment. or being unwise in reference to God, or living without reference to God. So Job is saying to his wife, you sound like someone who is living without reference to God, or what you're saying doesn't align with who God is. And he goes on to say, will we indeed accept the good from God, but not accept the adversity? And that may be challenging to hear because what Job says shows us it's an acknowledgement that God has power over both good and adversity. What Job says is not easy to hear because it means that God has authority over both good and adversity. He has authority over what we would call difficult and unpleasant. And sometimes he doesn't do anything about it, even though he has the power to do so. In this case, in Job's case, God doesn't directly cause Job's suffering, but he does allow it. And that's hard for us. Job's not saying that suffering's good or that pain doesn't matter. He's not saying that God finds joy in it. What he's doing is acknowledging something more than that. He's acknowledging that suffering exists, but God is still good. And it's in the fact that God is still good, his character doesn't change, even though we might suffer, we find stability in him during suffering. And we're going to wrestle with what God allows. We're going to struggle with suffering. But while we do, we also need to hold on to who God is in that suffering. Because God allowing something is not the same as God abandoning you or forsaking you in suffering. And if we struggle in that, when we suffer, we shouldn't, it's easy for suffering to get on top of us, and that's all we see. But instead of looking down at the suffering, we should look at Jesus first. Because when we look at the cross and the gospel shows us what we need to see. God didn't distance himself from suffering. God didn't abandon us to sin. Jesus not only died on the cross, but he also suffered greatly. And, when you think about your suffering for a minute, and I think about how I've suffered and compared to what Jesus has been through, he was rejected, he was betrayed, abandoned, denied, accused, condemned, mocked, shamed, humiliated, beaten, scourged, struck, pierced, nailed, crucified, crushed, and forsaken. So Jesus understands suffering, and he knows what your suffering is like and what my suffering is like. And in his case, he didn't control it, and he could have. He didn't escape it, and he could have. He obediently stepped into suffering on our behalf. And in doing so, he paid the price for our sin so that in him we might live, we might know God. The cross shows us that God can allow suffering, he can use suffering, and still be completely good. Suffering in and of itself is not evil. It's often the result of evil, but it's not evil itself. But knowing that doesn't remove suffering, doesn't remove the tension that comes with it, doesn't even answer the question as to why we suffer or why God doesn't fix it. But it does give us a place to stand, not in our understanding, but in God's character. Life contains both good times and adverse times. Genuine faith holds for both. Job doesn't try to control his situation. He accepts what he can't control and anchors himself in who God is. Job doesn't understand what's happening, but the reason he can say what he does is because he understands who God is. And I think Job's situation reveals something in all of us. We're comfortable receiving good things from God. We all love to feel blessed, but we struggle when we can't control what he allows. We struggle when we suffer. We struggle with faith and trust when we're suffering. We all struggle with things like health scares, financial pressure, family breakdown, unexpected loss, all of those things. Then we can make a big list. It's often it's not just the pain of suffering we struggle with our loss of control. Our passage finishes with, "In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." Job feels deep pain, but he understands that his pain does not define who God is. Pain and suffering don't define God's character. Sometimes people want to use it to do that, but it doesn't. We make the best decisions we can. We live as righteously as we can. But no matter how well we do, we'll never control everything. And if we think we're able to do that, we're living in the illusion of control because control is an illusion. But trusting God is not. Or is it? And we all need to ask ourselves that question. Do we trust God for who he is, or do we like what he can give us? That's something we all need to consider. Either way, suffering will still be part of our lives. The question is not whether we will face things we can't control. The question is, will we anchor ourselves in God and his character when we do? Because our circumstances don't define who he is. And when you think about it, would you rather have God's character to rest in, or would you rather have an answer as to why you're suffering? Because I think God's character is going to be far more powerful than a simple answer as to why. And I have no doubt if you're listening, someone listening is in a situation right now that you can't fix, and you're suffering. You don't know why, and there's nothing you can do about it. You've tried, you prayed, maybe you tried to believe more, have more faith, whatever. You've done everything you know to do, and it's still there. You've asked God to remove it, and he doesn't do it. And a lot of those things that we do in suffering are because we are reaching for control, or we have some kind of illusion of control. And this is a call to surrender the illusion of control. Surrender the illusion of control. If you're suffering, stop trying to control it. Stop reaching for control. Accept what you cannot change and anchor yourself in God, understanding his character, knowing that he is highest, he loves you, and he is ultimately the ultimate good. A call to surrender the illusion of control. Now, what would it look like if you did that? And here's some practical ways that you might be able to do that. Every week, grow, live, go. We grow in our faith, we live our faith, and we go into the world with our faith. Grow. Examine where you're holding on to control. We're all doing that somewhere. Ask yourself honestly, where do I feel like I need things to go my way to be okay? I absolutely have to control this, or I'm just not going to be able to take it. And bring that before God this week. Could be anything. Could be a lost job, a lost loved one, whatever it might be. But bring that before God this week. Not to ask God to fix it, because that's just trying to control it, but surrender it. Surrender it to him. God is not asking you to understand everything. He's inviting you to trust him. Do that. Trust him. Surrender control and trust God. And live. Practice trust in real time. It's always good to exercise. Like you go to the gym, you get stronger. The same thing with faith. When something doesn't go your way this week, something frustrating, unexpected, maybe painful, whatever it might be, just pause for a moment and say, God, I trust you here. God, I trust you here. Not because it makes sense, not because you have answers as to why, but because he's still God. His character does not change. He's still good. And then go. Stop trying to control someone else's suffering. It makes us uncomfortable. We want to do something about it. It may be a compassionate thing. It may be simply because we're uncomfortable. But instead of trying to fix it or tell them it's going to be okay or whatever that might be, instead just stop, be present, and listen. Make room for their suffering. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just be there, sit with them, let them be honest without trying to fix them. And that's how we become people who people don't have to pretend around. And you don't have to hold everything together because God is holding you even when you don't know why everything else is falling apart. I hope you found that helpful. If you have, I'd appreciate it if you left a comment, a like, share it with someone. Anything you can do is wonderful. I'm very grateful. If you'd like to support what we're doing here, you can buy me a coffee. There's a link in the description. And we'd love to have you be part of the ministry and participate in it. Totally up to you, no obligation. Content's always going to be free. You can do what you like. But I'll be praying for you, and I hope you have a great week. If you have something specifically that you would like me to pray for, leave a comment, and I'll do my best to get to it, and we'll pray for you. Anyway, I hope you have a great week. I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you for listening to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. As you go, remember, following Jesus isn't about having all the answers, but walking faithfully with the truth you've been given. Stay present, think clearly, walk intentionally. And wherever Jesus leads you this week, keep walking, faithful, grounded, and free.